Hello and welcome to problem 329. This one asks the question of, one guy says, what if I flip the coin 3 times? Flip, flip, flip. And when we look at all those outcomes, what's the probability of getting exactly 2 heads? And the other guy says, well, what if we flip the coin 4 times? Flip, 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 flip. How many times? What would be the probability of getting exactly 2 heads? And which one is better? Which one has the higher probability of happening? 3 flips or 4? So I've drawn up a scenario for 3 flips. So this is the first coin flip. It could be heads or tails. Then the second flip, heads or tails, heads or tails. And the third flip, heads or tails, heads or tails, heads or tails, heads or tails. Each of these is 1/2, right? So we could put that on the branches. Each of these is 1/2. Each of these is 1/2. So there are 8 possible outcomes, right? Each of them is equally likely. All of them have a 1/8 chance of happening because you would take 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 for each of them, which is 1/8. So what we're looking for is we're looking for the ones that have exactly 2 heads. So heads, heads, heads would not count. That would not be good, right? But heads, heads, tails, that's good. That's one of the ways that it could happen. Heads, tails, heads, that's good. Heads, tails, tails, no. Heads, or tails, heads, heads, but not tails, heads, tails. Tails, tails, no, no. So out of the 8 possible ways, how many of these ways would have exactly 2 heads? This, and this. 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8, which makes 3/8. So if I flip 3 times, there's a 3/8 probability that we get heads and heads. I'm going to set that answer up on the top here. That's what we got for 3 flips. Now the second guy says, what about if we flip 4 times? So we need to add a 4th flip into this. The 4th flip could be heads or tails, heads or tails. Now we've got all the different possibilities. How many possible outcomes are there here? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and they are all equally likely. They would be 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2, which is 1/16. Each of these have a 1/16 chance of happening. Let's look at the ones that have 2 heads in them, and only 2 heads. So not heads, 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 heads. Heads, 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 tails, no, that's 3. Heads, heads, tails, heads, nope. But heads, heads, tails, tails, that's what we want. That's a good one. Heads, tails, heads, no. Heads, tails, heads, tails, that's good. Heads, tails, tails, heads. That has 2 of them. Heads, tails, 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 no. Tails, heads, 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 no. Tails, heads, heads, tails, that's yes. Tails, heads, tails, heads. Tails, heads, tails, tails is no. Tails, tails, heads, heads. Tails, tails, heads, no. And no, and no. So how many of these 16 do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 out of 16. So now what we're trying to compare is, well, what's bigger, the 3/8 or the 6/16? Well, wait a second, this can simplify, right? We can divide top and bottom both by 2. This is actually equal to 3/8, which means they're the same. Same chance with 3 flips as you get with 4 flips. So I guess neither of them are right.